I'm Betty Shuford Roberson. I was born in Georgetown, 1 block from here.
Oh, okay.
Georgetown seemed like the perfect town to me because I didn't know anything else. There wasn't a lot to do, but living where I did, we could walk down Front Street and window shop and roller skate on the sidewalk on Front Street, and this nice wide sidewalk in front of the courthouse across the street. And then I, of course, went to the Georgetown schools from right on through high school before I went to Winthrop. And Georgetown schools were very home-spirited and proud of their football team, and had some fantastic teachers. Mr. Bynum was the principal for my whole lifetime, principal and superintendent for a part of that time. First through 7th, and then it was when you're high school. There was no junior high at that time because it was just 1 through 7, and then 8 through 11. 13, I went into high school, and that was the year Pearl Harbor was bombed. I remember being in the 7th grade and all the patriotic things that we tried to do, and selling not war bonds, but war stamps. You had to save $18.75 worth of stamps to get a bond. The fellowship at school, the team sports, it wasn't much but football. We didn't even have a baseball team. Had basketball and football. And
Friday night games?
Friday night games, yes, right there behind the school where the library is now. Some of our classmates went off and played high school football and did really well. Paul Joseph, whose family had a business right down next to the town clock, he was a football hero. Excellent teachers, I think. I praise my English teacher, Miss Sadie Hazard, who taught me in the 8th and 9th grade. I hated it at the time that I got her the 2nd year because she was so hard, but she was so good. I remember her teaching me. I even learned when you say lie and when you say lay. And you know, that is a thing that even performers on television say wrong. And I cringe when they say, I'm gonna lay on the bed, because that's not right. You're gonna lie on the bed, and you lay on the bed yesterday. And that's the kind of teaching Miss Sadie did, and so I remember her well. And there were other really good teachers. It's kind of unusual that there are as many classmates still in Georgetown and in easy accessible distance. And we had a 3-day reunion. We're not going to do that again, but it was a lot of fun. We had a day at Litchfield in the home of one of our members, and of course a casual dinner downtown where voluntarily, if you wanted to do that, or some of them probably rather sightsee and check out the museum and that kind of thing. But we had about half the class downtown for a lunch together, and then Saturday night was the actual party of the reunion. I think our class members stayed closer than a lot of classes do, because most of them had family in Georgetown, so they'd come back, and it was like coming home. And then a lot of us stayed here. No, that was not clean. So we didn't, but we walked on the dock and climbed all over the dock and played on the lawns of the people at either end of the business district that would let us, and just window shopped. My father was chief of police. He was a businessman, and in 1930, I always think of the Depression as being later than that, but in 1930, his store failed, and he became chief of police for a short time, and then after that county treasurer, and he was county treasurer until his death. My mother, who had worked for him, took over the treasurer's job. To complete that term, she chose not to run for another term, but she did serve for about 2.5 years there. I remember a tale, but not the details, of there was a fight among two men in front of a store on the water side of Front Street, and across the street somebody, it was noticed, and he was nearby and ran and broke up the fight. I haven't heard that story in a long time, but it was an in-touch job. It wasn't a high-up job. He was, the chief was really a real policeman. In the 800 block of Front Street, which is right across from the River Room.
Oh, okay.
His business was on the land side of Front Street in the 800 block, and was Shuford's, and it had ladies and men's clothing. My mother worked for him in the store for a short time, and they were married. He had 4 children from his first marriage, and then they had 4 more. My sister Jean, my sister Irene, and my sister Ann and I were my mother's children. My mother moved here when she was 10 years old, she told me. My father came from Bishopville, and so I don't have native roots here past my parents. During the Depression, when things started changing and he couldn't manage the store, he said he made purchases for the store in New York on a sales trip, and before he got to Georgetown, he could not pay for them. His business had just collapsed. It was a tricky time for businesses in those days. I didn't know there was a Depression because all of my friends and neighbors lived and did like I did, and we played on the sidewalk and skated and drew.
Young girl.
Yes, I was. I was born in '29, and we drew chalk on the sidewalk and played hopscotch. And didn't know about spending money. A nickel was a treat, because you could buy a nice ice cream cone for a nickel down at the Winyah Pharmacy or at Walgreens. When we got to Walgreens on Front Street, that was a big deal.
When did that come?
I guess I was in about the 7th grade there. I had a job at the Winyah Pharmacy, which was a privately owned drugstore across the street on the riverside. But every time I got a minute off, I ran over to Walgreens and sat with my friends who hung out in the booths at Walgreens. I worked for a furniture company. It was Stalvy's Georgetown Furniture. Stalvy's had a hardware store and a furniture store side by side, and sometimes they were run by Mr. Stalvey and his brother, and eventually Mr. Ernest Stalvey took over both of them. I only went to Winthrop for 1 year, and then I came back and went to work for the South Carolina National Bank, and for Mr. Stalvey's first, and then to the bank. And stayed there until my husband went in the service, and we went to Fort Bragg and Alexandria, Virginia, near Washington for a couple of years before we came back, settled down in Georgetown, and it was here for the rest of our lives. I married Norwood Roberson, who also graduated from Winyaw, and he was a rural mail carrier. And we lived in my mother's home for a couple of years, and then we built a little house out in Kensington, which was a brand new development out there. But we outgrew that house because we had 3 children in a little over 4 years. Kim and Woody and Butler. Then a year later, I had a little boy who did not survive, but about 6 months. I had fun with that. Yes, I did. It's been 10 or 15 years since I did it, and I just did it for a couple of 3 years. But it was fun because I wrote about things that I remembered. My brother, when he was in high school, was interested in the sea cloud. It docked here in Georgetown for a period of time back then. I don't remember the year, but I was a child. And my brother, when it sailed from Georgetown, he ran away from home to go off on the sea cloud. And when the ship docked in Charleston, he got off the ship and there was our daddy standing on the dock. And he told Rob, he said, "You can go, but you could not go without saying goodbye." And so he sailed around the world on the sea cloud. Our family has numerous mementos from Holland and Spain and France and England and the Orient. It was a fabulous life for him. Maybe not for his wife, but they got along well with it. And then my other brother, Donald, was at Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 41, and survived, and stayed in the Marines in the Pacific throughout the war, and decided to stay in it permanently. When the war was over, he stayed in it, and he retired a full colonel a number of years later. Probably wrote about Winyaw School and about the museum and Front Street on Georgetown. I had the 700 block. Yes, yes. Mr. Dundas' store was there where there's a florist there now, isn't there? Mr. Dundas was a friend of the parents of one of my good friends, and so she would go to Mr. Dundas's house and I would go with her, so we could go upstairs on the back porch of his apartment there overlooking the river. So that's what I remember about Dundas's. There's a doorbell in his, still there in that building, that is significant in the Jewish religion. And after Dundas's, Mr. Carter, who was a big businessman in Georgetown, James Carter, opened a men's shop there, and that men's shop transferred through hands, had 3 different owners before it ended up being a florist now. A&P was on Front Street, in the 800 block where there's a furniture store now.
Augustus, Carolina, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Across
Yes,
from
yes,
there.
yes, yes. The A&P was in that block, and at one time was on the Riverside and then moved over to the one I'm remembering. And Ford's had groceries, but when the A&P came, we had a chain store. Right here, yes, we did. Except for Easter and Christmas, we'd drive to Charleston to do special shopping. See him on the street, yes, we would, and because his car was conspicuous. And I remember specifically one time pulling into a drive-in that was on Church Street, no longer there. And at the end of Church Street, there was a drive-in ice cream place. And we drove in, and my oldest child was standing in the front seat like they used to do, and looking out of the window, licking her ice cream, and Mr. Baruch drove up on the next side and waved at her. So I have seen Mr. Baruch.
Did you ever run into his daughter, Phil?
I saw her on the streets. I never knew her, but she was in the news, and so I, knew she was here. And she had a companion. Can't remember her name.
Severin?
Yes.
Severin.
Mm-hmm. And I would see them. They'd come in to go to the post office, probably the bank, and Ford's store. Everybody of any consequence went to Ford's store. It was wonderful. And Mr. Baruch, I understand, even hired or delegated or asked Mr. Ford to get unusual things that he'd need. One was a donkey.
A donkey?
Yes. I was baptized in Duncan Church and joined the church when I was 12, and only lived 2 blocks from there. So my sister and I would walk to Sunday school, and then our parents would come for church. And it has been a wonderful church since I was a teenager, and they had what we called League. It was the youth program, the Methodist League. And so as a teenager, I started going to the League services and joined the choir, and a youth choir, and have always participated in the choir and have served as a circle leader and worked in the kitchen some. And it's just a great group of people, and we work together. But what I remember, it's a very old church, and I do like history. And so it's a beautiful church inside, it really is. And I find mementos in the archives room of my parents participating in things, way back when I was, even maybe before I was born. And so I feel like it's really home. And we've had a series of really nice, wonderful ministers through the years.
Who's the present minister?
Eddie Usher.
Pastor Eddie.
Pastor Eddie, yes. And he and his lovely wife have been grand. We've enjoyed having them and benefited from it.
And Isabel Mayer?
Isabel Mayer, I remember as a lifetime, not idol, but someone I looked up to and just learned a lot from. And one thing I remember about her, she's always there when a tragedy happens, or at least she was for us. It was, and I think she pretty well hovers over the congregation, or did. And because I particularly remember one time when I lost a 3-month-old infant, and how she supported me and said things that still come in my head. One being, she said, "You will always have a baby," and that is so true. So, and she just was a special person, and we've lost a lot of comfort. I think it is. The windows, you know, we're not modern or anything. We have had yes, we have had during the years people who wanted to modernize, and thank goodness we always had enough people with deep roots that wanted to keep it like it should be, sacred. And Mama worked in the kitchen, and Daddy, I thought Daddy was the preacher. He did everything. He walked down Front Street asking merchants for money to pay the preacher. Those were hard days. That was in the 30s.